Well, my name's Mark Powell. Welcome to another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. My special guest with me today is the Reverend Mark Leach. Mark is the CEO of Never Again Is Now, and we're talking about the rising threat and tide, I guess you could say, of anti-Semitism in Australia. Mark, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Mark, it is great to be with you. It's a great honor. Thank you for having me. I'm just delighted to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, now look, I always ask people this first fundamental question, and for many ways for me, I find this the most interesting because it's really a testimony of what God has done in your own life. But can you tell us, how did you yourself become a Christian?
Well, that's a long story, so I'll give you the short version. Though you have said you just want, this is the most interesting part. So maybe we'll just finish after this, and everyone can.
Oh no,
So,
there's a lot more interesting stuff to come.
so look, I was born in a village in Zambia. My mother was a German Jew whose family had been refugees from the Holocaust, as did she. She married a Roman Catholic white South African who smuggled emeralds and diamonds and fought as a mercenary. So I didn't have a very religious upbringing. At age 15, however, I was invited to a youth group in a local Anglican church in Cape Town, South Africa. And the youth group had a very important ingredient that was missing from my experience at the time, and that was girls. And so I went to this little Anglican youth group and I met girls, and that was great. I also met God, and that was even better. And at that youth group, people used weird language that I'd never heard before, like you can have a personal relationship with God. And that was strange to me because with my Jewish and Catholic background as a second generation Holocaust survivor, I always thought there was a God, but that this God was uninvolved in the world and not present when you needed him most. And from my Catholic side, the idea was that God was really there to stop you having fun. And if you were enjoying anything in life, he'd smack you over the hand and tell you to stop it. And so the idea that you could have a personal relationship with God was really weird. And then they used even stranger phrases. They said, you need to ask Jesus into your heart. And I thought, well, that's just weird. And then they said stuff like, oh, and you need to be born again. And, my mother was a doctor. I'd grown up around medical journals. I knew my anatomy. And I'm like, that made no sense at all. But over a period of time, people explained this to me. I'd never been to a Protestant church. I eventually stopped going to the youth group. But about a year later, I was dragged along to what I now know to be an evangelistic concert in the mid 80s. And a guy there preached the gospel. I have no idea what it was about. I went because a girl I was interested in was singing in the choir. And again, God used girls to get me home. And the guy asked for people at the end of the night. He said, if anyone here wants to become a follower of Jesus, ask Jesus in your life, stick your hand up. And he went from, there was this big auditorium. He said, I was in the middle section. He said, people on the right, anyone in the middle? And I sat there as he came to our section, and I knew I wanted to become a Christian. I knew this was right. But I was sitting next to my buddy on one hand and another buddy on the other hand. And I was terrified that if I asked Jesus into my life, nothing would happen at worst, and I'd just get mocked and laughed at by my friends. So then I did nothing, and then he moved on to the next section, and I remember praying, and I said, God, if I ever get an opportunity to become a Christian, please give me the courage to say yes to Jesus. And literally, as I finished saying that, he said, and now your last chance, if anyone anyway wants to become a Christian. And it was like I was propelled out of my seat. I was overcome with this just experience of divine love. I can still feel it today, like this complete, my being was suffused in love and in the presence of God. And I shot down to the front, and I surrendered to Jesus, and that changed my life in ways that at the time I could not have begun to imagine. So that was the start of my journey, being a follower of Jesus. Yeah.
So I've got to ask, your mum being Jewish and your dad being nominally Catholic, what did they think of this?
Well, Mum felt like a deep failure. I mean, she and her family were secular Jews, highly assimilated. But she felt she'd sort of raised us nominally Catholic, so I'd got with Jewish cousins. So she felt like a failure as a Jew and as a Catholic. My father was completely dismissive. He was in jail at that point, and he'd get on the phone and say to me, "Oh, how's my, born again Christian mother effer?" So I
Wow.
copped a lot of, let's say, lack of support and encouragement from him, and from my mum and friends and everybody. But I just think God used that. God, I suspect God gave me such a powerful encounter with Himself at that key turning point that I never doubted. I have never doubted. And that stood me in great stead, because no matter what anyone said, all the rejection and the opposition I received, I just never shook me. I went, yeah, that's okay, but I can't argue with God's love for me.
Yeah, wow. And
Mm.
now you're a graduate of Moore Theological College, the same as me. You've been in ministry longer than me, a fair bit longer, although you look younger, which is actually troubling to me. Um, that just shows up my insecurity. But you've left recently Anglican pastoral ministry to
Yeah,
do this new ministry, Never Again is Now, combating anti-Semitism.
yeah.
Now, that's a huge thing. Um,
Mm,
very
mm.
few people leave the ministry to start another ministry, particularly like this to Jewish people. How did that happen, and what was the tipping point for you?
Yeah, look, um, I've always been convinced, obviously from my, well, not obviously, but from my family background, I've always thought Christianity was Jewish, and that as a follower of Jesus who was Jewish, I needed to help other Christians understand their Jewish roots and so on, and was always very committed to that. Have led groups to Israel and so on for years. I watched, and I've also been very concerned with the rise of anti-Semitism, particularly with the rise of Islamic anti-Semitism. I've been very concerned about the rise of jihadist Islam around the world, and I've followed and tracked that closely. So I watched the events of October the 7th, 2023 unfold, and like everybody else was just, absolutely dismayed at that. But then on October the 9th, there was this infamous rally in Sydney that ended up at the Opera House. It started in Town Hall outside the Anglican Cathedral in Sydney. And on the morning of the 9th, my daughter Freya called me from Sydney Uni, where she was studying, and said, "Dad, the pro-Palestinians are planning an anti-Israel rally." And I just thought that was appalling that, less than 2 days after the greatest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, the blood hadn't yet dried in the south of Israel. They're still chasing up terrorists around the area. And on the very day when the New South Wales government was going to light up the Opera House in blue and white in solidarity with Israel, there would be this protest that would be just so full of hate, and so full of anti-Semitism. So I phoned the police and I said, "Listen, I'm an Anglican minister. This march is unauthorized. I want to come in and counter protest." And they said, "Well, Mr. Leach, we're advising the Jews to stay out of the city today. And if you come in, we can't guarantee your safety. And if you try and do anything, we will arrest you in order to prevent a breach of the peace." So, I've been in Australia 30 years. I've picked up some of the vernacular. So I hung up the phone and I thought to myself, bugger that. I just thought, that is so un-Australian. You can't, on this day of all days, shut the Jewish community out of the center of their city. So I put on a clerical shirt, I took my squash bag, rolled up a big Israeli flag in my bag, went and stood on the steps of my Anglican cathedral, where 1,000 people gathered with this hate-filled rally. And as they started chanting and carrying on, I took out an Israeli flag and I stood there and I waved a flag. A bunch of keffiyeh-wrapped thugs chased me out of the square. I beat a hasty retreat up Bathurst Street, ran and hid behind a police van. And they dispersed the crowd who were threatening to slit my throat and kill me. So out of that, I just realized, I thought, we have to make sure that the Christian community in Australia doesn't do what the German community in the 1930s did, which was 20% of the Christians supported Hitler, 20% opposed Hitler. The middle 60% were just quiet and went along with it. And in fact, your listeners may not know this, but the most the most common day for rounding up Jews in Germany in the late 30s and 40s was on a Sunday morning. The authorities would call the pastors and say, keep your people in church this morning. And they'd sing their hymns, and they'd say their prayers, and they'd listen to their sermons so they wouldn't hear the sounds of their neighbors being rounded up and taken off to death camps. And it just seemed to me that as a pastor and as a Christian who knew my history, and as a Jewish follower of Jesus who knew my theology, we needed to mobilize the church in Australia to stand with the Jewish people in this time. So out of that, Never Again is Now was formed. It quickly grew into a national movement, and by the middle of last year, it felt like God thrust me out of the church and said, Mark, I want you to be not just the pastor to a local congregation. I really want you to be a pastor to the whole Jewish community around Australia, and I want you to be an agent for cultural renewal to help wake up the church and wake up Australians to renew this culture and stand alongside the Jewish people and Western civilization more broadly.
Wow. I mean, there's so many questions to ask and plumb the depths with you. But just to go back a little bit, that protest rally you went to on October 9, just 2 days after the attacks of October 7, that pro-Palestinian rally, or anti-Israel rally, we should probably call it, that was unauthorized, you said?
Yeah. You need a week. You need to give the New South Wales government a week's notice to be authorised. So the police because they didn't have that authorisation, the police had all the authority they needed to shut the rally down, to stop them marching to the Opera House, to disperse them. They could have done any of that, and instead they chose to allow them to really capture and dominate the city centre, and then the sort of spiritual and iconic centerpiece of Australian identity, the Opera House. And I think that was a really tragic failure of policing and political will. I could say more, but that's
I mean, I just want one other thing to say there is that they actually said to you, they warned you that if you came, they would arrest you for inciting violence, even though this was an illegal protest march?
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's much easier to move on a Jew than to move on 1,000 jihadis. And so I think that's one of the challenges we face in the Western world is political Islam occupies and operates on the basis of intimidation. And so our police in Australia are fantastic, do a great job. But like so many police forces in the Western world, they bend over backwards to try and keep the peace and appease the Muslim or Islamic street. And I think because they don't want to be accused of being racist, they don't want to incite any violence, so it's easier to move on peaceful Jewish and Christian protesters. Yeah.
All right. So, Mark, there's obviously a big cultural, political movement and context around all this. But you and I are both pastors. Let's get into the Bible as a starting point. Tell me, what do you think the Bible has to say about the place of Israel today, this side of the Messiah, in the salvation plan of God? And I'm thinking in particular of passages like Romans 11. Can you outline for us your convictions on this?
Gosh. Well, there's that. That's. Let me preface this by saying a Anglican New Testament scholar, N.T. Wright, wrote a 1,700-page book on Pauline theology. So there's a lot to be said.
Yeah, that's okay. You can just summarize it in 3 minutes.
I'll summarize it. What I'd say is this: Christians disagree. There are a range of views, as I'm sure you and your listeners are aware, on the role of the understanding of Israel. And by Israel, I'm assuming, well, you might mean the Jewish people, or you might mean the nation state of Israel. So there's some complexity there. Here's my principle. The ideas have consequences. Interpretive frameworks, the interpretation we bring has consequences. So it seems to me there are certain ways of interpreting Paul and Romans and the relationship in Christian theology between the church and Israel that have had catastrophic consequences. And so while they may be valid readings of the text, amongst other valid readings of the texts, they end up resulting in anti-Jewish pogroms and ultimately the Holocaust. I'll give you an example. There's a view that simply put, the Jews, the Old Testament were plan A. The Jews were given the law. They were meant to obey the law. They couldn't do it. This was plan A. God set it all up to show that even the Jews with the law couldn't achieve his outcome. So then he sent Jesus to as plan B, to fulfill the law perfectly, and for the church then to replace Israel. And so the followers of Jesus now replace Israel, and God has now cast Israel and the Jews out of the promised land because they rejected their Messiah, Jesus. They're forever banished into exile. God's turned his back on them, and his favor now rests entirely on the Christian community. That has a long tradition. It's going back to Marcion. It's a 1800-year tradition. And I know people in your circles and mine, maybe not yours, but certainly in mine, in Sydney Anglicanism, who would hold a variation on that. My response to that now is, you might be able to justify that from individual texts, but if there are alternate interpretations that don't lead you to the Holocaust, as that view of theology does, and 1800 years of anti-Semitism and persecution of the Jewish people, and even today, that theology is used to justify pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel stance, to justify a lot of the anti-Semitism we see. So you should reject that because of its consequences and form alternate readings. So, sorry if that sounds a bit technical, but I'm assuming your listeners were all highly intelligent Presbyterians.
Oh,
so
yeah.
what that means for me is, when I read Romans 11, for example, Paul says that there's a mystery that the Gentiles who followed the Jewish Messiah Jesus have been grafted into this entity of Jews who follow Jesus, and also Jews who don't yet follow Jesus. And they form one new olive tree with the ingrafted Gentiles. And at some point in the future, all Israel will be saved. And Paul himself says that's a mystery. Peter says Paul's often confusing and difficult to understand. So we shouldn't feel bad if we can't understand how every little nuance of Paul's writings fit together. So my view is, I want to reject any interpretation of the New Testament, which is a Jewish document, that results in anti-Jewish sentiment. And then I want to try and be faithful to what's there. And that is, I want everyone to be the follower of the Jewish Messiah, Jesus. And then I want to pray like crazy and trust that God has not for 1 second given up on Jewish people. As Paul says in Romans 9, to them belong the covenants and the glory and the patriarchs. So if God has changed his mind on the Jews and gone, well, you stuffed up, so now I'm going to go to plan B, how do I know he won't change his mind on me? Because I'm going to stuff up, you're going to stuff up just as much as any Jewish person ever has. So God's covenant, God is faithful to his covenant in the face of Gentile and Jewish unfaithfulness. And that's what I rest entirely on that. Now, what do I say about the nation state of Israel? That gets down to eschatology. That's another whole diet. That's another whole little lecture. My view is, it just seems inexplicable in purely human terms that the Jewish community would be brought together in their land in 1948 in the way they were. So I am open to the idea that this was one of the most extraordinary, miraculous acts of God. And in some way that I don't fully understand, fits neatly into his overall purposes. And I don't want to say much more than that.
Okay. It's interesting because you said to me a couple of days ago when I was talking to you about doing this interview, I said, wow, you've left Anglican pastoral ministry very secure, yeah, all of the what you might call the trappings and around that. And how are you supporting yourself? And you said, well, it's a lot of private donors, most of whom are Jews, which I found interesting. And you said, yeah, I've never had as much opportunity to share Jesus with those from a Jewish faith or even a no faith at all. Can you explain what you mean by that and what's been your experience since stepping out of pastoral ministry and into this one?
Yeah, look, it's very interesting. We have in our ministry, we have a strict no proselytizing policy. So we we never proselytize. My ministry is not to convert a Jew to Christianity or Jewish people at all. What we're about is working to exhibit the love of Jesus to our whole country, to work for the cultural renewal of our country, on the assumption that as we do that, we will be protecting and standing in solidarity with the Jewish community. So it's a ministry of love towards the Jewish community and towards Australia. What I found is, as I do that, lots and lots of people want to know why the heck I'm doing it. And they want to know my story. The Jewish community are far more used to getting rejection or outright apathy from the Christian church in Australia than they are from getting love, particularly love that wraps itself up in an Israeli flag and puts themselves at physical risk, and then love that leads a secure, tenured job of 30 years to say, I'm all in to make sure that the Holocaust doesn't happen again in Australia. I'm all in to say, if anyone wants to come for the Jewish people, they've got to come through the Christians first. So it just seems to me the principle of the Bible is when you love somebody, that when you love somebody, they're much more likely to listen to your motives and your worldview and the gospel than when you just lead with the gospel and try and convert them. So that's been my experience. And it's extremely humbling, let me say, and an extraordinary privilege. So in private, if a Jewish person drags it out of me, I will share my story and what I believe, but they have to drag it out of me.
Okay. I'm just thinking, I'm actually thinking a lot of what Paul says in Romans 10. It's my heart's desire is for Israel to be saved. You know, how do
Mm-hmm.
you understand that as a pastor and as a Christian, a
Mm.
follower of Jesus, particularly as you
Mm.
relate to Jewish people? How would you apply that, do you
Mm.
think?
Well, I mean, my heart's desire absolutely is for people to know the fullness of life that God has in store for them, and I long for everyone to be saved in the fullest sense of that word, not just you know an insurance ticket to get to some disembodied heaven in the future, but to know to know for the Jewish people to know the fullness of everything that the God of Israel has for them, that
Mm,
I think has been made available to them in ways many of them don't understand through Jesus, their Messiah, and the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy
mm,
Spirit. I think that's available, and I feel I long for everyone to know that.
mm.
But let me say this, which might be provocative. I long for myself to know that. I mean, I do for sure, but I also don't. I just think there's so much more of God to know. So I just think that's where life lies. And I long for myself and for my Jewish family and friends
Mm.
and every
I mean, I
Australian.
really hear your heart, and I really admire your humility in how you're approaching this, and of your obvious deep love for the Jewish people. Um, this is a hard question. Okay, where do you think someone is at spiritually, even though they have all the promises of the patriarchs and the
Mm,
covenant, all of that, if they've rejected Jesus? Now, I'm not trying to say we don't love or anything like that, but yeah, what would you say is their relationship with God in that sense?
um, yeah, look, I think when I think there is no. I think every person, in my experience, the Jewish community, like the everyday Aussie community, is made up of individual people who are all on a journey, all struggling, and there's a whole range. So there's no one Jewish thing, even in the Orthodox Jewish community. So I have met many Jewish people who are struggling with and grappling with God and their relationship to God in a way that I think many people who profess to be Christians aren't. Um, so I would say my encouragement to everyone is to get to know Jesus, because I think in him is the fullness of life. I but I also feel, and maybe this is just something that comes with age, and it doesn't sound very Sydney Anglican. I also feel a great peace that it's not up to me to make judgments about people's eschatological salvation. I just want to love and encourage people wherever they are to move towards God. And I think as they do that, they'll find Jesus. So what I say to the Jewish community, when Jewish people have a conversation with me, I say, go back to the scriptures, read the Bible yourself, read the Torah, read the Tanakh, and have those conversations. And you know what? I have this conversation. I mean, I spoke at a big Jewish event on Sunday, and this older guy came to me after, and he said, "Mark, you know, where was God on October the 7th?" I had a conversation with a guy who's a Holocaust survivor. He's mid-80s and beautiful person. And I mean, and he just said to me, Mark, you know, he and his father both were in Bergen-Belsen in the camps. He was a young boy. His dad was the president of the synagogue in his city before he went into the camps. After, when they both survived the camps, and his wife, so his mother, all the women died. His father never went back to synagogue after the camps. And at 85, the son, who was sitting across the cafe from me in Sydney, said, you know, Mark, I try to connect with God. Sometimes I can, and sometimes I can't. So he's on his own journey. So I encourage people. So what I say, the problem of suffering for me, this is how I lead into it. I say, I've found as someone who grew up in the shadow of the Shoah as a second generation survivor, Christianity offers me a picture of the Jewish God who was crucified and identifies with and understands the full depths of human evil and suffering, absorbed it into his own being, triumphed over it, and gives me hope. So that's where I go. Sorry, that's a long answer to...
No, I actually think it's a really good answer, because I think one of the things that's unique about Christianity is at the center of our faith is the emblem of the cross.
Yeah.
So we have a suffering Savior. How do they respond when you talk about the Jewish God, the Christ suffering? And because I think that is profound. It's Isaiah 53. It's everything, like I'm thinking in Zechariah when the sin of the people will be removed in a single day. How do Jewish people respond when you share about the suffering God of Judaism?
Mostly that we don't follow that up. I haven't gone much further. So I think I bear witness to the difference Jesus made in my life, and that idea of a suffering God has made in my life. And I don't know. I suspect I will, if I ever, I will only see. I don't know. People might come back to me in 10 years' time and tell me this has had an impact. I don't know. That's a good question. I'm in a, I don't know. So, but here's what I was going to say before. Not my problem. Yeah, maybe it's my problem. I just see a lot of Christians who don't live. They confidently proclaim justification by faith, and they understand 2 ways to live: inside out and back to front. But they don't actually live as though it's true. So I struggle with that. I struggle with that a lot, actually. The failure on the part of people who proclaim to be Christians. So I have become, in my old age or middle age, a lot slower to judge others, and a lot quicker to go, I need to pay close attention to how these ideas and how these truths are they real in my life, in my behavior, in my speech, in my gentleness, in my compassion, in my love for truth, and those things. So sorry, I don't know what that was, but that's just
No, it's really helpful to understand where you're coming from. And
yeah.
let me ask you a really spicy question, because I
Okay.
was telling some Christians friends of mine that I was going to interview you, and I would say they're pretty. I'm not going to say anti-Israel. Let's say suspicious, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, and I've tried to sort of plumb with them. Okay, where are you coming from? And they would argue that the people of Israel are under God's judgment, right? Because of their rejection of Jesus and their ongoing moral rejection of his law. So a very liberal society with homosexuality and that.
Mm.
Therefore, their argument is they shouldn't be in their ancestral homeland at all, right? They shouldn't be supported with foreign aid from America or Australia. Um, they have no right to be there. How would you respond to that?
Well, there's a uh, so I would say what? So God only blesses you if you're obedient. I'd just go, that just seems nuts, right? I think God's covenant and God's grace it far exceeds our sinfulness. And I think I would say it seems to me the resurrection of the state of Israel is a great act of grace that seems it's miraculous, it's inexplicable. I mean, it's offensive, but the gospel is offensive. So I'd say to them, your entry into the kingdom of the heavens, of the God of Israel, even though you look, read Romans 1, you Gentile, or is actually what I love, you foreskinned one, which is actually you foreskin Gentile who Romans 1:18-32, you are evil yourselves, but yet you think you can be it's okay for you to be drawn into the new creation, but somehow you think God can't forgive and bless and love and bring his people back to their ancestral homeland because they don't fit your definition of what spiritual acceptance of God looks like. I just go, I don't buy that. I think it's arrogant. I think it's anti-Semitic. That said, look, there's this ultra-Orthodox Jewish sect who also reject the nation state of Israel for the same reasons. They say, well, this is a political state. The Messiah hasn't brought us back, so we should reject it. I'm not convinced, but I hold loosely. I just think the nation state of Israel, even if you're not a theological Zionist, as a human being, we should stand with Israel, who are this tiny little liberal Western democracy. They're people like us, established by the United Nations, who are being attacked on all sides by the enemies of our civilization, jihadist Islam. So shame on you for not wanting to support them.
Yeah, I mean, there is that sense of, Israel has a right to exist, and so we don't want to see any people exterminated. I'm wondering if, I forget the exact chapter, but I'm thinking of, in the end of the book of Deuteronomy, with the mountain of blessing and the mountain of cursing, depending on covenant obedience. Would that play into you? Do you think this understanding? And I guess I'm thinking of where the Orthodox Jews are coming from, or the ultra Orthodox, that, well, actually we are experiencing God's judgment because of our covenant unfaithfulness to his law. Is
Yeah. There is certainly that's a strand. Now that was also a strand in Second Temple or first century Judaism as well. The Pharisees who would say, the exile was ongoing, and even though they were back in the land, there was a greater exile to come, a greater return to come. And the Jewish theologians and scribes have grappled with that for millennia. I know. I just think God's a God of grace. So you read the book of Deuteronomy, is the inheritance of the land. And even in the first time Israel went into the land, did they go in and did they keep it because of their obedience or because of God's grace? And was that possession conditional upon obedience? And you go, it was all of God's grace, and it's also all of our free will and their free will. So yeah, the two go together in a mystery.
Okay. What's your take on the recent protest marches that we've been seeing in our capital cities? Like there was a massive one in Sydney, probably 80 to 100,000, depending on who you listen to, by the Palestinian Action Group. It's very interesting because it's now come out that the Iranian embassy has been expelled from Australia because ASIO has discovered that they have been actively involved in the bombings of a Jewish restaurant, a Jewish synagogue. How do you think that might play into the protest rallies that we've seen?
I think the pro-Palestinian movement should rightly be understood as a domestic terror organization. They're the vanguard of a concerted attempt by the autocracies of the world, China, Iran, Russia, working through the radical left and homegrown jihadists to undermine and divide Australia from within and weaken Australia. So I think that's the sort of cultural and political DNA of these events, of these protests. And the people, which is not the same as to say that the people who attend are all jihadists or pro-Iranian or want to destroy Australia. I think one of the great things about Australia is we are a compassionate people, and what the relentless propaganda has done is it's mobilized that sense of compassion and empathy for Middle Australian. You know, when you're faced with endless pictures of war from Gaza, people believe the idea that Israel is this all-conquering bully, and the plucky Palestinians are the victims of a terrible genocide. Now, my view is that framing is completely inaccurate. That Israel is fighting the existential battle against a vastly numerically superior enemy. That Hamas is solely responsible for the death and destruction in Gaza, and that if people use their brains, not just their hearts, they would understand that the war could end at any moment if Hamas laid down its weapons, released the hostages. If Egypt opens its border and set up a refugee camp in the Sinai desert, all the women and children could have fled, and then Israel would have been free to wipe out Hamas in a month. So I get very frustrated at the gullibility, and as Gad Saad, this Canadian psychologist, says, the suicidal empathy of Western Australia, of Australians and Westerners in general. It's very concerning that they would be siding with and with terror organizations.
Yeah. I mean, there's a really interesting question here about why doesn't Egypt or any of the other surrounding nations open its borders? And also, I heard an interview with Benjamin Netanyahu on the podcast Trigonometry, where he said, look, if Israel wanted to commit a genocide, we could do it tomorrow. We've got the military arsenal to do that. How do you respond to, I guess, a growing conservative concern of those that are in pro-Israel, that Israel is actually losing the propaganda war and therefore should stop now and losses? Your response to that?
Yeah, I think it's more important for Israel to finish off Hamas than to try and win over Western opinion at this stage. The reality is Israel's in the best geopolitical strategic position that it's been in decades. Hezbollah have been defeated, Iran's effectively been defeated, the Houthis are being defeated. The Arab states around about it, the Gulf states, want to make peace and sign up to the Abraham Accords. Israel has shown that you can only find peace through strength. Like, we all know that. But the world does not want Israel to be strong or to win. There is relentless propaganda from volumized by the Chinese, the Iranians, and the Qataris that flood our screens in a coordinated fashion to tell the lie that Israel is evil and Israel cannot be allowed to win. If Israel does not defeat Hamas militarily, it guarantees that there will be another October 7. I mean, this is just the reality. So my own view is Israel has to finish off Hamas, and the propaganda war can be fought and won at a later stage. And I think it will be. I think when all is done and dusted, when the Arab world makes peace with Israel, the useful idiots in the West will be left with egg all over their faces as they go, we were backing the terrorists, and now the Arabs and the Muslims themselves do not support these terrorists and instead want to make peace with Israel.
Yeah, it was interesting. The other week, I was interviewing Dr. Tim Orr from the United States, who's a Christian apologist, and really well read and researched into Islam, and he was sharing about Shia Muslims and their eschatology, that the end of the world cannot come until the last Jew on earth has been killed.
Correct.
That's ingrained in their theology, isn't it? And
Yeah.
it means a civilizational war at that point that can't be resolved.
No. So the problem with Australians is we're so secular, we don't take religion seriously. The truth of the matter is the war in Gaza is not a war over land. It's not about occupation. That is a complete lie. That is just a propagandistic, that's propaganda. It's not about occupation. It is about land, and it's not about land. It's about religion. So the land in Islam, once, as I'm sure Tim, who's great, has told your listeners, once land has been conquered and occupied by Muslims, it forever belongs to Allah, and every Muslim is therefore duty bound to recapture that land for Allah. And so the Shia and the Sunni Muslims will not stop attacking Israel until they have recaptured the land, or they realize that it is impossible to militarily defeat Israel. And at that point, Islam adopts a different strategy. So that's what we're facing. And Spain is next. Andalusia was under Muslim control. The Muslims are planning an attack on Spain. And that's
question. How do you think the Christian church should relate to our Jewish and non-Jewish neighbours, especially at this time?
I mean, Christianity is really simple, isn't it? It's like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So the answer is, for a follower of Jesus, a Gentile follower of Jesus, they should think to themselves, if I was Jewish today, how would I want to be treated? And then go and do that. And I'll tell you how most Jewish people want to be treated. They want to be treated just like every other Australian. They don't want to be attacked because of a particular view of a way a war on the other side of the world is being conducted. They don't want to be made to feel like they don't belong in this country. They don't want to see the streets of their city occupied by people calling for the eradication of their homeland and a genocide. I mean, this is the crazy thing. Like every week on our streets, you have people saying, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That is a call to eradicate the Jewish people. And if you were a Jew, you would not want to be hated and called a Zionist. Everyone says, "Oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist." That is a difference without a distinction. So just as a Christian, if you're listening to this, think about how would you want to be treated, and then go and treat Jewish people that way, with love, with respect, with solidarity. Stand up for them. Don't let them be bullied. I mean, we make a big deal in our schools and our workplaces and our churches that we don't tolerate bullying. But we as a nation are tolerating the systemic bullying of the Jewish community of Australia. We allow 100,000 people to march across the Harbour Bridge in an act of Islamic domination and intimidation of the Jewish community and of Western civilization, with a photo, of the Ayatollah and cries for the destruction of Israel ringing out, and denunciations of the Jewish community under the banner of anti-Zionism. And we allow that to happen all the time. And the Jewish community are tiny. It's 150,000 people in this country. There are a million Muslims and a whole lot more crazy leftists. And now racists on the right side of politics popping up. So if you're a follower of Jesus, if you're a Christian, stand up for the Jewish community, show love towards them, join our movement, come out and march in favor of them. Invite them to your home, go to their shuls, invite them to church. Just show them that you're an ally of theirs.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting because I want to pick up on something you just said there, that there's an irony, a deep irony that I've noticed, that Israel's being accused of genocide, and yet the political charter of Hamas is explicitly the destruction of Israel. That's genocide by definition. And you mentioned a few slogans which we all have heard, from the river to the sea and Intifada. Can you explain, because I think this is really important, can you explain what the river to the sea means and also what Intifada means?
So from the river to the sea is a call for a one-state solution. So from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. So the Jordan River is the boundary with Jordan. And what they are calling for is the eradication of the state of Israel and the cleansing of the land of all Jewish people. So this has happened across the Middle East. 850,000 or 1 million Jews have been ethnically cleansed from the rest of the Middle East, from the Muslim world. And that cry is explicitly a cry for a one-state solution. Actually, there'll be two states. There'll be Jordan as a Palestinian state, and then Israel as a Palestinian state, free of Jews. So then you say, well, what'll happen to the 9 million Jews there? Well, if you ask these people, they'll go, well, they can submit to Allah, or they can leave, or they can be killed. I mean, those are the choices under Islamic occupation, right?
Mm.
So that's what's on offer. Because your listeners may or may not be aware of this. I mean, the Palestinians on at least 5 occasions have rejected the offer of an independent Palestinian state. They don't want that. They want the eradication of the Jewish state. They don't just want a Palestinian state existing alongside a Jewish state. They want the end of Israel. So that's what that means. The call to globalize the Intifada was a strategy that Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Liberation Organization adopted when they realized that Israel could not be defeated by the surrounding armies of the Arab countries. Militarily, the Arabs had tried numerous times to invade and destroy Israel. They kept losing. So then they said, well, okay, the strategy has to be internal terrorism. So the PLO, Arafat, are the original Arab terrorist organization. And in the 70s, they were hijacking planes and killing people all around the world. And then they changed their strategy to attacking and killing Israelis in Israel. And so, for example, they had the first Intifada, then it all settled down. Then after the Oslo Accords, Arafat was offered, under Clinton, with Ehud Barak, they were offered 97% of the West Bank, a capital in East Jerusalem, pretty much everything they wanted. And Arafat walked away from that and instituted the Second Intifada, which was, instead of a two-state solution where we can live in peace, let's massacre and bomb and terrorize Israelis at home. So over 1,000 people were murdered by Palestinians in that Intifada. They were, kids were blown up on school buses, pizza parlors were blown up, there were stabbings, there were beheadings, there were rape. It was a terrible, terrible, terrible time. And it was as a result of that Israel then put up a wall. And, when the Palestinians when people go, oh, the terrible Palestinians, they live behind checkpoints and walls, that's only because they were committed to murdering as many Israelis as they could until the walls went up. So when someone says globalize the Intifada, what they are saying is globalize Islamic terror against Jews and against infidels around the world. It's a call for beheadings, for bombings, for suicide attacks, for terrorism. And that's what we're hearing on the streets of Sydney and Melbourne and all around the country. And when anyone says it's not, they are just lying. it is a lie. It is a terrible, terrible thing to call for. And my view is people who call for that should be arrested and charged with insurrection and incitement to violence.
It seems pretty clear that that's exactly what it is, an incitement to violence, which is, again, strange that going back to October 9, when you first attended that rally, I saw what you posted on your own phone, and I was just shocked. It was one of those wake-up moments for me where I thought, wow, Australia has changed.
Yeah.
And is Islamic terrorism functioning on our own soil as almost like an intifada of intimidation and threat. So you're the CEO now of Never Again Is Now. If people want to find out more, what should they do?
They can visit our website, neveragainisnow.com.au, and sign up and get emails from me weekly and join a chapter. So we have grassroots movements of Christians and Jewish folk and everyday Aussies meeting all around the country. We're planning on October the 26th, a national day of Australians against anti-Semitism. So if you're listening to this and you think, hey, hating Jews, marginalizing and bullying Jews in Australia is a bad idea, can I ask you to give us, 2 hours of a Sunday afternoon on October the 26th and just come out and stand in solidarity with the Jewish community and take a stand for the kind of country we want to be? Because anti-Semitism is a problem not just for the Jews, but for us. I mean, it's un-Australian. This is not who we want to be. So we need to actually get mobilized and get activated and get connected and stand against it. So go to our website. We have another website, australiansagainstantisemitism.org. You can find us on either of those sites. Sign up for a rally and join the movement of love, which is what we are.
So October 26th, Sunday, and all the details on the website?
All the details on the website. If you want to organize an event in where you are, so we have people organizing grassroots events up in Cairns and Townsville and all the way down the coast to Mullumbimby and Coffs Harbour, all the way down to Adelaide and maybe even Hobart. Who knows? You can. We've got a sort of a rally in a box kit that can help you just pull together folk who think hating Jews in Australia is a bad idea and take a stand. And then we'll join everyone up digitally on the day and try and send a message to Australia that we're a country that rejects racism and tribalism and stands with the Jewish community.
Great. Well, look, thanks so much for joining us, Mark. May the Lord bless you in your reaching out to the Jewish community in love, and really appreciate you joining us today.
It's been a great pleasure. And, I think it's just such a wonderful journey of love to be a follower of Jesus, and with all its complexity and difficulty. So I just thank you for the privilege of talking a bit about the journey that God has me on, and I hope it's been an encouragement to you and your listeners.
Yeah, great. All right, so that's been Mark Leach for Never Again Is Now. You can check him out on his website. You can even, I think, invite Mark to come and speak if you'd like to. That's always a good thing. He's got big 2 thumbs up, so that's good. And I hope you've enjoyed this episode of AP's Profiles in Christian Living, and I look forward to seeing you next time.